The last time the nurses walked out, 30,000 elective procedures and outpatient appointments were postponed or cancelled. The same will be happening today. How much longer must Britons endure this?
Well, you're absolutely right to say that it's deeply regrettable that the nurses have chosen to go on strike once again. We are working to resolve this dispute. Ministers have met with the Royal College of Nurses on numerous occasions, and we want them to call off these strikes, which will have an impact on patients. Of course, our advice to anyone who is unwell and seriously unwell today is to use the NHS as you would normally do. And we have worked hard to negotiate a series of derogations with the union, which will mean that services will be able to continue. But there will be a knock-on consequence, particularly in dealing with the backlog that's so important if we can get past the long shadow of COVID and get the NHS back into a better position. And that's really for the RCN and other unions to work with us and to call off these strikes, because they are harmful to the public and we don't want them to continue.
Later today, Mr. Jenrick, a waiting game may play in your favour. If the rate of inflation comes down, surely your hand at negotiations and the willingness to settle may be easier. Do you think lower inflation rates today may help settle a lot of these disputes?
Well, we will wait to see what the figures are. They'll be released in a few minutes' time. But if they do show that inflation has peaked and is beginning to come down, then obviously that's great news for all of us, including those working in the public sector. One of this government's 5 principal objectives is to halve inflation over the course of this year and to bring it back down closer to 2%, where we want it to be. And it does seem as if inflation is now starting to slowly fall. That will make life easier for everyone, and hopefully that will make it easier to settle these disputes. What we've said to the unions across the public sector is, come in and talk to us about next year's pay. We're going to be very open, in fact we already have done in most cases, of setting out what we think the costs and affordability challenges are across the public sector, what we think inflation is likely to be over the course of this coming year, and then work to find a sensible way forward that is affordable to the taxpayer and which doesn't add to inflation. Because if the news today is positive, that inflation has peaked and starting to come down, the worst response that we as a government could make to that is to increase public sector pay significantly and therefore lock that inflation in for longer than is necessary and get into a kind of homegrown domestic spiral of inflation. We should be responding to the first tentative signs of falling inflation internationally by redoubling our efforts not to make the issue worse domestically.
And you talk about these tentative signs, you talk about inflation, falling slowly, and yet we hear from the Governor of the Bank of England saying that actually it's beginning to fall, expecting it to fall sharply as energy prices go down. So my question is the Chancellor, is the Prime Minister, are they overplaying their hands on trying to manage inflation? Because we hear from Pat Cullen, the General Secretary of the RCN, she's had very successful meetings with Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, on Friday. She's written to him. She describes it as collegiate. And yet the words she used was that she suspected that other figures at the top are blocking the progress.
I don't think that's right, with all due respect to Pat Cullen. Everybody across government wants to treat this matter with a spirit of collegiality, to be as reasonable as possible, to meet with representatives, to talk to them about next year's pay and the challenges that public sector workers are facing. But it is simply absolutely critical to everyone in this country that we do get a handle on inflation. As I say, if energy prices are beginning to fall internationally, then that means that some of the extraneous factors are working in our favour. What we mustn't do is domestically lock in inflation by seeing large pay rises in the public sector or indeed across the private sector as well. But the one area of the economy that the government has responsibility for, the public sector, we've got to be very careful to ensure that we're treating it sensibly, not leading to further rises in inflation, and thinking about affordability for the wider taxpayer.
I just want a straight answer from you, and then I'm going to ask David Miller for a straight answer because he used to work at the Treasury. But why can't you settle this year? Is the cupboard bare for this year? Is this like hire purchase or something that you're paying ahead for next year? Why can't the effects of inflation, the effects of the cost of living crisis are affecting these workers now, here and now, not next year, right? They can't afford their bills now. That's what they're worried about this winter. Why can't you say, here's a few quid to look after you this year?
Well, the way that public sector pay has worked in recent years has been through independent pay review bodies, and the unions, like most parties in British public life, argued for those because it takes the politics out of this and ensures that it's not ministers ruling by fiat, but it's through evidence-based policy making where the different groups come together, they present arguments, and that's what's happened this year. Each of these different parts of the public sector have been scrutinised by independent pay review bodies who have taken into account inflation, retention and recruitment challenges. What we don't want to do is undermine that. I think that would be very harmful for the long run, and I don't think unions really want that either.